We're 1 minute into the webinar, so let's kick off. I'm going to hand over to Leanne McNeil, who's going to introduce the webinar and introduce our main speaker today, Brendan Day. So over to you, Leanne.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I've just been told that my Opus banner is back to front, so that's good news for my very first webinar. So technical things happen, we'll change that for next time. But welcome to everybody tonight in what is the next series of In Conversation chats with some of our very special guests. Tonight we have with us Mr. Brendan Day. Can I call, is that what I shall call you, Brendan?
Yes, I've been called many other things, so that's just fine. You call me Brendan.
And I'll get Brendan to tell us all a little bit about himself in a moment. But before I do, just some housekeeping for everybody. Tonight we'll be taking any of your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you've got any questions for Brendan throughout, please post them to the Q&A point. If you've got any technical issues, please share those through the chat feature. So if we can just do that distinction tonight, that would be great. Also, as per usual, our webinars are all recorded and these can be posted out later along with the transcripts for anybody that wants those or who might have missed it and would like to watch it later. So as I said, tonight we're joined by Mr. Brendan Day. Brendan can probably tell you a lot about himself, but reading his bio, you'll see that he's heavily experienced in the death care industry, but I think probably more relevant to tonight's conversation, and I'm going to read this, Brendan, if you don't mind. He's now the director of the Crematoria Abatement of Mercury Emissions Organisation and currently the director of Green Cremation Network and secretary and executive officer of the Federation of Burials and Cremation Authorities. It was interesting when Brendan and I caught up earlier this week, I think it was, to have a little bit of a chat about tonight and tonight's conversation. Brendan was really strict with me in saying, Leanne, I am not a tree hugger. I'm a pragmatic environmentalist. So we'll see what we think about that by the time we get to the end of tonight, Brendan.
Yeah, no, that's great, Leanne. I think that is exactly what I am. I think it's important to stress that I've been, in this sector for 40 years now, managing cemeteries and crematoria, and especially topical today on Earth Day, we are facing these environmental issues, and I face them, in my mind, I'm facing them as a manager of a cemetery or crematorium. That's the angle I'm approaching this with, because I say my background is not in environment or environmental science. I've got my 3-litre Jag sat on the drive outside, so I'm burning petrol in the way I shouldn't. So, I'm not here to bang a drum. I'm here really to discuss what we're doing in the UK, the environment, what we're doing as a sector, and perhaps see if we can transfer some of that learning to yourselves and to anybody else, and also to learn off you, to see what you guys are doing in Australia and the Southern Hemisphere, and bring that sort of our way. That's what's important to me.
Great. So what I might do then, Brendan, is Brendan doesn't have a presentation as such for this evening. It is very much an in conversation. So what I might do is share the one slide, Brendan, that you did want our listeners to see, and you can talk us through that high level government policy and law in regards to what's happening, I guess, across the UK. So if people would just like to bear with me just a little bit, I will get that happening. There we go. No, screen sharing has failed. Of course, it worked 5 seconds ago. Pardon? I just said screen sharing has failed because that would be right.
Well, if you want, I don't mind, so that we can jump on. And basically, just all I wanted to share was the pathway that the UK is having to take between now and 2050 to hit our carbon reduction targets. And these are the carbon reduction targets are, there we go, that's the one. So these targets are set in law. And only 2 days ago, we were told by Boris Johnson that some of these have been brought forward 15 years. So as you'll probably know, there's a big conference taking place today with President Biden on the environment. And you can see that top line, the black line, if we don't take any of these measures, that's where we will end up at 2050, somewhere where we are now. But the bottom of that line, the blue line with the green, that is where we've got to get to. And I think what's important, what this illustrates, this slide more than anything else, is the different steps the UK is having to take, including demand reduction and efficiencies, the first one, the purple. So it's reducing demand for carbon intensive activities. And included with that is even things like meat production, dairy, having to reduce sort of the amount of meat we eat, which is a big setback for me, and dairy we have, and then taking up low carbon solutions, the orange, that's electrification. So the government's taken those low hanging fruit of producing electricity through coal, that's being phased out. Gas is going to have to be phased out. We're going to have to look to expand in hydrogen and other low carbon technologies, CO2 capture. And then the third area is the low carbon hydrogen electricity production. That's going to be increased massively. And finally, offsetting emissions, the green, that's going to be the planting of millions of trees across the UK. And I think what that slide tells us is this is societal change. It's not somebody else's problem. It's not because China's using too many power stations and they're going to switch their power stations off. Both in Australia and in the UK and across the world, society itself is going to have to change. And I think the important thing is that means that our sectors are going to have to change. And we can either shape that change ourselves or that change will be forced upon us. So I think it's really important, if it's one message I can get over tonight or this morning, is it's going to affect you. It's going to affect your sector, and you don't have to do anything, but if you don't do something, you're likely to find other people will see this as an opportunity to change. They will come to market with new products, new services, and you will simply end up out of business. So I think it's really important that we all grasp this as an opportunity and look to change. And something we've done in the UK now recently is create something called the Environmental Stewardship Group. And that's made up of the Federation of Burial and Cremation Authorities, the Institute of Cemetery and Crematorium Managers, and also the Cremation Society. And that has been facilitated by a company called Cemetery Development Services Group. And what that brings the major cemetery and crematorium trade associations together. And during this year, there's a series of webinars taking place to find out from everyone else in the sector, field directors, masons, florists, suppliers, investors, where we are as a sector. So we really feel that we need to find out where we are now. We can create that baseline, and then next year and the year after, we're going to involve field directors, masons, everywhere else in trying to find our path forward. But I think it's, it is really important that everybody takes this on board if you want to stay in business.
Brendan, how has this been received in the UK so far, certainly within this industry?
Well, I think at the moment it's been received very well. The conversations are now taking place. The questions are being asked. But I'm literally just on the news this morning, one of the commentators was saying, the moment the government and the governments of the world are at the stage of setting targets. And of course, setting targets is the easy part. The more difficult part comes when we try and hit those targets. And then, because it's societal change, it starts to impact on all of us, and it starts to impact on our businesses. And so the debate's taking place, but there is some negative voices, shall I say, or questioning voices, people who question, why should we do this? Like an area that we could discuss would be memorials, for instance. Now we have we have a lot of granite. Granite memorials are very popular in the UK, both in our cemeteries and our crematoria. Black granite predominates. It is the granite of choice without a doubt. But for us, that's being shipped from all the way across the world, from places like China and India. So it's got a huge amount of carbon embedded in it, in the transportation of it to the UK. So the question now has been asked, can we not use local granite? Now, the only problem is there is no naturally occurring black granite in the UK. There are grey granites, there are pink granites. So that's, you know, this is a question that we think the memorial industry will need to look at. And then they'll need to consider it because there's some real implications starting to come about now. And the government have announced that both maritime and air transport is going to fall within the carbon targets. So it's likely there's going to be carbon taxes. So again, if you're shipping stone all the way around the world, there's likely to be potentially a hefty carbon tax on it. And also on one of our webinars, which Opus kindly hosted for us, we had one local authority in the UK who are going to introduce a carbon tax. So families want to bring in a granite headstone, which has been imported into the UK, they will have to pay a tax on it for the carbon. Now, you know, I can't say enough. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying, you know, that's where we're at. That's the sector we're going to. And it may well be people are happy to pay carbon taxes, but it, you know, it is going to become increasingly apparent, I think, throughout the sector that these questions are being asked, and some authorities will take steps to address the climate emergency, which in the UK, 70% of local authorities have declared a climate emergency in their area. So they are looking at ways in which they can reduce their carbon footprint.
So talking about some of those ways, and you were just talking about memorials then, I know there's certainly conversation around different types of memorials. So maybe not even a permanent memorial. I think when you and I were chatting the other day, you mentioned, you know, often some of the trends would show that after 10 years, these memorials aren't actually visited anymore. So, you know, do we really need these permanent memorials versus a more temporary style?
I think that, you know, this is, and it's another question because, you know, our sector, we talk a lot about tradition. You know, it's very common, especially sort of on the funeral directing side. There's, you know, there's always talk about families want tradition, they like tradition. I'm not convinced about that. I think the pandemic has shown that people quite regularly move to new types of funerals in the UK. But yes, when we think that granite, you know, is one of the hardest materials on earth, it will last for thousands of years. Do we really need a grave marker made out of a material that lasts thousands of years, when certainly anecdotal evidence shows that within 10 years, a large proportion of families are not visiting anymore. So for us in the UK, certainly when I was a manager, we had the issue of all these Victorian memorials and also memorials from the 60s and 70s, which were not fixed so well, becoming a problem, becoming a hazard, which local authorities had to pay large amounts of money to put right. And when we cleared areas, we turned them into lawn sections, all this granite would either be buried on site or go to landfill. Again, it occurs to me that virtually on that basis, there's potentially a quarry in every town in the UK of old stones, which could be reused and recycled if they just had the faces, the stone removed for down sort of like 10, 15 mil, and then recycled. You know, I think these are the things we need to look at. We need to consider, again, and perhaps masons need to consider, do they need to look towards alternatives? Now that's really hard. It's hard, you know, that sort of change, especially if you come from a traditional family firm, you know, been doing this for sort of 5 generations. But, you know, things change, times move on. You know, a lot of areas in our lives. I'm just sat here behind my double glazed aluminium windows. I'm sure before that we all had wooden windows for the last 500 years or whatever. We don't anymore. There's a better product out there. Let's move to it. So I think Masons is a fantastic opportunity. And I was at a cemetery recently where they have oak headstones. Really nice carved oak. Or again, you know, I'm living here in Cardiff in Wales. I shall be going up mid-North Wales later today. All the slate headstones in the cemeteries look fantastic. Victorian headstones. That slate is still there. Now, it is probably more expensive to quarry. But again, we're told that if they can have the volume of work that's currently going to China and India, those prices could be brought down. So perhaps we should be looking again to that green capital that's tied up in all our countries, rather than traveling all the way around the world to bring it back to us.
Yeah. And actually, we haven't got any Q&A, but it's probably something even that I would ask those that are participating in the webinar tonight. It doesn't have to just be Q&A. If you've got any comments around that, around how you are seeing perhaps changes in memorials and monuments in your areas that might reflect some of what Richard's saying, please feel free to share that information through the Q&A as well, and we can incorporate some of those thoughts into conversations, because certainly I know we're seeing here in Australia, you know, the emergence of some of those more digital technologies and digital monuments and those sorts of things that may not straight away replace some of those granite ones, but might over time, as you say, sometimes change is incremental.
Yeah, funny enough, I noticed somewhere on the memorial, digital memorial, they were referring to themselves as digital masons, the guys delivering that service, and they see themselves as in that tradition of masons.
But just something different,
Yeah, and again, as I say, I was on this as a fantastic organisation in the Ukraine called the British Register of Accredited Memorial Masons, and the Federation, we're on their management board, and they're a great group, and they're producing great products at very high standards. So I wouldn't want anybody to think that I've got a down on granite or a down on memorial masons in particular. I say it is just these demands that have been increasingly placed on us, that we will need to respond to one way or another.
Actually, we have got a question or a comment that's come through the Q&A in regards to memorials. And the question asks whether you feel, Richard, the skill set of memorials, sorry, Brendan, the skill set of memorials in the UK to produce sufficient memorials to replace those imported from India. So I guess, is they're the product, and is there the skill set of masons in the UK to take that place?
The short answer to that is I do not know. It's not an area I know, but what I would suggest is that if the demand is there, it will be fulfilled. The masons and the quarry people will meet demand. I've no doubt about that. But no, I don't know the answer to that, and I think that's part of the issue we're all facing at the moment as we start on this journey. We've got so many questions. We've got to do something. You know, the status quo will not be an option. We have to do something, but it's just what? You know, what is the solution? And something, you know, I've discussed with people, if I was still a manager at a crematorium now, and my authority declared a climate emergency, and I had £20,000 or whatever it was, would I spend that money on abatement for my crematorium for a particular emission? Or would I spend it on electric lawnmowers, on electric hedge trimmers? You know, what's going to be better for the environment? Where's the best way to spend that money? It's going to give me the biggest, you know, return. And again, at the moment, we don't have those answers, which is why with the Environmental Stewardship Group and John Cross on CDS, who's doing sterling work on that, is looking into these things. But certainly the authority that is putting the charge on imported granite, they've held discussions with quarries, and they've been told that yes, you know, they can deliver. And I'm sure, you know, if the demand increases, then so will supply.
Yeah. And in fact, that might answer another question that came through around that challenge or the ease of being able to access stone and granite, whether it was actually just easier to get it from overseas versus getting it in our own countries. And so perhaps even if that is the case, it might take things like carbon taxes that encourage us to actually sort of look closer to home.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it will. And obviously, as I say, this you know, this is going to cover sort of all areas of our sector. Cremation's no different. Like the UK, cremation's near 80% of the sector. And we predominantly use natural gas to fire our cremators. We are seeing sort of our first generation or second generation. We've had electric cremators in the UK for many, many years, unabated. But now we're seeing that first or second generation of electric cremators that have got abatement on them. Now, I think there might be 2 sites in the UK. I think there's only 1 abated crematorium site that's running at the moment. I might be wrong, because it's something that is changing on a daily basis. So that's something we're looking at. But predominantly in the UK, out of our 310 sort of crematoria, probably 307 of those are all gas-fired, natural gas. Now that produces, you know, the single largest carbon footprint of any crematorium. And you don't do anything else to our crematoria, whether it's heating it or, you know, cutting the grass or whatever, comes anywhere near that. So again, it's going to be important that we look for alternatives to how we cremate. Now, you know, electric may be the answer, but I don't think it's immediately the answer, because I say with over 300 sites in the UK on gas, we have to look, you know, at any other way that we can power those cremators. Now, again, you know, some areas, some suppliers are delivering and researching hydrogen. And then, you know, that is key when government are looking to sort of a blended supply of hydrogen. Equally, I know there are sort of biogas, bio-LPG. There's a crematorium in Holland, I think it's called Dieren in Holland, where they have now altered, they've been using gas from fracking, which clearly, you know, is a bit of a no-no and getting a worse reputation as we talk. So they have now converted onto biogas, onto bio-LPG, which can be done, you know, quite readily, quite simply, and it's 100% green. So that is, you know, that's another question now we're asking in the UK, and especially as we've got to make these changes in the near future, within the next 30 years. You know, if you're buying cremators, they're going to last at least 20 years. You need to know that they're future-proof, so they can change and adopt any of the new technologies which are being brought in. Because
when you talk about cremators, and obviously it's not just the cremators themselves, but it's also what's going into it. And there was there's certainly been a big push here in Australia in recent years around, you know, cardboard coffins, and people thinking that cardboard coffins are more environmentally sustainable, but that's not always the case, is it?
No, you know, that is a hot debate, to pardon the pun, in the UK, because yes, you know, are cardboard coffins the future? You know, they do have obviously benefits for the bereaved families, you know, against chipboard. We're sort of predominantly chipboard, but there's concern then about the amount of NOx being produced from these coffins because of the formaldehyde in the resins. But again, it's, you know, it's a complex picture. There isn't, you know, it's not a matter of one being good and one being bad. And again, you know, I come back to, that's why we need sort of the research in the sector. Any research, empirical research we can get, you know, we would greatly receive at the moment. We have to keep all these things sort of within that context, that we're looking at that big picture of the environment. And it's any of these little things we can do to build and add then the better. But certainly, yeah, we're considering, I know we got an organisation in the UK, the Funeral Furnishing Manufacturers Association, and this is something they're considering with their members who manufacture coffins. There's also, you know, the vehicles, the hearses and the limousines, where we're seeing, you know, more electric vehicles come online. But again, I've heard concerns, you know, because the limos are so much bigger and they're custom made, there's so much carbon locked up in building that vehicle, you know, whether it's electric or petrol, you know, in the long run, over its lifetime, it might not make, you know, a great deal of difference. Yeah, it really is. It's a complex picture.
Yeah. So I want to talk about burials a bit yet too, but before we do, questions come through, and I suppose what this really highlights is when we think of cemetery operations, we do think of cemetery, we think of our cremators and what they're pumping out, but we might sometimes forget that even the way that we manage our grounds can in fact, you know, needs rethinking. And a comment made here, or a question, I suppose, in our Q&A says, I'm a smaller cemetery, so, you know, look, where do I start? But they do mention that they're starting to take small steps, just starting to look at battery operated tools. So grounds maintenance is another real area that we could start to focus on.
Absolutely. I think small steps are the key. And in one of the Opus webinars, my colleague Julie Dunk, who's the Chief Exec of the Institute of Cemetery and Crematoria Management, did a paper, and she gave some excellent examples of small steps. I think that was webinar 2 that we did for Opus. So if anyone can look that up, it's well worth it. But yes, it is all about small steps. It is about the maintenance. Obviously, the first thing is, and something in the UK, the Environment Agency controls things like water pollution in the UK. And in recent years, they've become increasingly interested in water pollution. As again, you know, we look at the construction of coffins that we're burying in the ground, if they contain the formaldehyde they contain. There's also, you know, if bodies are being embalmed, the chemicals that are being used for that. And again, I'm not anti-embalming, but if I'm the manager of a cemetery and I'm responsible for what's leaching into local watercourses, I want to know that what funeral directors are bringing to my site is going to cause me a problem. I'm not going to be the one that has to pay to tank the cemetery to prevent it leaching out, or the one taken to court for polluted watercourses. So we do have to be careful, we do have to be aware, and I think if we can reduce the longevity of any chemicals used in coffin construction or in embalming in that side, then we should. I think that should be encouraged so we don't damage the environment and pollute the watercourses. How we maintain our grounds, again, I think that's really important. And I don't have to go back too far in my career when we were using chemicals like 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, which is sort of basic Agent Orange, that was used in Vietnam. You know, it was like a lunar landscape when we'd finished spraying some of our grounds, and we destroyed all biodiversity. So we can look at less intensive maintenance, having more, you know, wildflower areas, providing areas for greater biodiversity, looking at the plants we use. Do they suit the conditions? If it's very hot weather where you guys are, or if it's particularly wet where we are, you know, we need plants to suit the conditions. We need to reduce our maintenance cycles, perhaps identify key areas around the chapels, at the entrances, where we do maintain that high standard. It is welcoming, but equally, you know, we're open, we're honest, we're saying to the public, we recognise there's a need for greater biodiversity, and we're going to deliver it. And also another thing, and I'm sure you guys are probably into it more than us, water harvesting. You know, so because we do a lot of bedding in the UK, and we used to grow the bedding at the crematoria in years gone by. But as everybody knows, with bedding plants, especially when you plant them, there's a lot of watering to be done to get them in. And then during dry weather, again, we're watering hour after hour. And so that's going to become, you know, a greater problem. I think the last year, because it's Earth Day, they've announced, has been the hottest in Europe since records began. And we keep hearing this about being the hottest or the wettest. So again, we have to react to that. You know, we can't continue, as with our cemeteries in the UK, we can't keep building them on sort of areas with high water tables or floodplains. We must take into account the environment far more when we're delivering and developing our services.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think most of us listening here tonight have probably got a cemetery perhaps under our control or within the vicinity that was probably built in the wrong place. Cemeteries were built, you know, in an area that was just outside of town because somebody needed a cemetery. But we all look back at them now. I know certainly in areas where I've managed, where the reality is it wasn't an area where there's high water, or it wasn't an area that was particularly rocky underneath. So it requires heavier machinery in order to dig that. So I think that notion of really good cemetery planning within our settings it's not been well done in the past and could be a real area to tap into.
I think like another thing we're trying to get in the UK is lift and deepen, we call it. That's where we will reuse graves after a set period of time. And there's been a lot of research done. We've suggested to government it should be 99 years, providing the families no longer own the graves, they're not Commonwealth war graves, you know, there's no historical, social, cultural interest, that we could redig those graves, take any remains out, put them in an oak casket and bury them in the very bottom of the grave and reuse the grave. So at the moment, we can't do that in the UK. We cannot exhume remains without the next of kin's permission and the grave owner's permission. So if it's a grave from the Victorian times, it's impossible. So we keep adding more and more cemeteries. We have to keep maintaining the old ones, but we have to, again, and this costs millions and millions. It's like £3 million to open a new cemetery. And I know in my last authority, because it's just by Birmingham, it's in the middle of a conurbation, that, you know, the choice of land was incredibly limited. So the one site that we eventually chose, we had to cap disused mine shafts before we could use it. And yet this is across the road from a cemetery where they've got graves that, you know, haven't been visited for decades and decades. Families have long gone. And so we need to, and again, this is something that was done in the UK up to the turn of the 19th century. In churchyards, graves would be reused, you know, for generation after generation. Unfortunately, you know, in the 1830s, we stopped that. We started selling graves in perpetuity. And so we're now inheriting these problems of these Victorian cemeteries, can't reuse hundreds of thousands of graves, got to maintain them, and trying to find more land. So for us, you know, that's a key ask of government we're lobbying for, is to be able to reuse graves in a compassionate manner.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things, and a question again has come through Q&A, and this is something I'm quite interested in as well, because we're sort of starting to see a bit of a move here in Australia as well towards that notion of green burial sites or woodland areas where perhaps people aren't putting in those monuments that are going to, you know, be there forever, and instead they might actually be planting trees. Scott talks here about the environment response of planting 30,000 hectares of trees a year in the UK. Do we think, or are you seeing in the UK more of a take-up of these green type sites and the planting of trees within them?
Yes, I think that without a doubt there are more and more woodland burials. It was Ken West who started the woodland burial movement back in the 1980s, I think it was, late 1980s. And we do see more and more. And also it's a good use. Again, if farmers, you know, you can't keep producing all this meat that we're not allowed to eat anymore. You know, it's another use of their land. But we are seeing that. And I think, again, it's a generational thing. you know, as the younger generations come along, they're making the arrangements for their parents' funerals, and they're much more, you know, in contact with the environmental movement. I recall we've been with one family in the cemetery, Woodland Cemetery, and the gentleman was there burying his wife and children. They were choosing the grave, the deceased partner and their children, and showed them the woodland site, and the grass was natural, the trees. Loved it. He says, but you will keep cutting the grass regularly, won't you? And his children said, no, Dad, you know, that's not the point of it. So I think it is a growing need. I would have to say 80% of the population still being cremated. You know, we have 600,000 deaths a year in the region of, so we're looking to over 400,000 cremations a year. I don't think all that will go to woodland. And again, you know, we would talk about 1,000 graves to an acre. So, you know, it would take up a lot of land. Again, if we cannot reuse the grave spaces, it's just going to keep taking up more and more and more land. And,
seen some great practices, a few examples out here in Australia where different cemeterians have taken areas of land that might have actually had some sort of significant vegetation growing in the area. It was a special environmental place, and by respectfully turning those into green burial sites, it's actually added another layer of protection to the important vegetation and the animals that live within it, because obviously there's much less chance that it's likely to be bulldozed and developed.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, again, we shouldn't lose track, or we shouldn't lose sight, you know, of where we're coming from. I thought this recently when I was by a local church. It's a sort of really old churchyard and lovely old sort of Norman church. Grounds, you know, great variety of wildlife. When you think that for a lot of people, our cemeteries and crematoria are green spaces, which they really appreciate. Some people, it might be their only local green space. So that's the background so we're coming from. And we can build on that and use, you know, our grounds differently. To say that we can use them to protect areas. You know, we shouldn't sort of beat ourselves up too much. And I think, again, that's where, if we're innovative, if we use our imaginations, we can build on what we're coming from. We can improve the products and the range of products we're delivering, you know, to meet the needs of the new environmental agendas that have come along. And I certainly, again, like in the UK, when we started introducing the abated cremators, that was a massive leap forward for us. You know, I can recall cremators before our process guidance notes were brought in by government, and we had to have the manufacturers, you know, and I know that I know you use very simple, I think, you know, in Australia you use things like the FT3 cremators are fairly common, they're exactly the same as in the UK. I think the only difference is we have the abatement on. Now, the highlight might be Mercury. Everybody talks about the Mercury abatement, but it's only Mercury that we're taking now. We're taking out the particulates, we're talking about the furans, we're talking about the dioxins, the acid gases, are all brought out through that abatement plant, which has been added on to the cremators. And so we've been able to evolve the service we deliver to be a much cleaner service. Without any impact really on what we're delivering to the families. So I think with innovation, working together across the sector with the masons, the funeral directors, our manufacturers and suppliers of cremators and everything else we use, our cemetery leaders and teams, our crematoria leads and teams, you know, we can grasp what the future has in store for us and take this as an opportunity to continue service improvement.
You talk about innovation and changes in the sector. So we're starting to see and hear a lot more about things like resumation and composting. As somebody that hasn't, I mean, we've really not seen a lot of that out here in Australia yet. Can you perhaps share with us what these two new techniques are involving?
Certainly, like I suppose the one that's got the most traction at the moment out of those is Resumation. We've seen that, we've heard about it for a number of years in the UK, and what's held it back, I think, not only is the new technology, but the problem was, certainly when I was working with the local authority, we were going to bring it in. We got the planning permission, we got the budget, got the building and everything, but we couldn't get permission from the water authority to let it, what comes off the Resumation, the liquid which comes off, go to drain. So the Federation, we did a study involving Sheffield University, the manufacturers of the resumator, LBBC. We all got together, we involved government in that, and we carried out 5 resumations, basically using cremation documentation, and then the liquid which came out of the resumator, that was sampled by Sheffield University. It was peer reviewed by another university and found to be perfectly okay to go to a treatment plant and be treated as normal. So I found that a really interesting experience. The Resumation was, a nice machine. It fitted in easily to the building. We put it in. There is, I think the question will be asked about public perception. We've people talk about putting granny down the drain. I've heard that once. I've heard it 100 times. But equally, there was a time when people said about putting granny up the chimney. And I think, a moment will come, and it could be the moment now, that we saw this with cremation in the UK. Like 1902 Cremation Act legalised cremation in the UK, but by the 1940s it had only reached 4%. But within a generation, within 30 years, by 1967, it was more than 50% of all funerals ended in a cremation. And that was because, the time was right. People like the very Reverend Dr. Peter Jupp have written on this extensively, that post-war, there was that modernism movement. People wanted something modern, they wanted something different. And I think, that was a driver. Local authorities found cremation better, funeral directors found it better, and it took off. I think the same could happen with Resumation. Now could be the time.
Yeah. It's interesting. I note that we've probably only got a few more minutes left. But I think, Brendan, Scott made a really great comment about what is tradition, and we talk about tradition and what that actually is. Is tradition the provision of our end-of-life service, or is it how we actually physically dispose of a body? What is actually that tradition?
Well, that is a good question from Scott, and I think he should keep his questions to himself. Yeah, no, I really don't know what tradition is. I think it's one of those things, isn't it, that I think beyond the fact that perhaps when we make funeral arrangements, whatever the first person we arranged a funeral with, we want that for the second person. Yeah. Like for the parents. So if your mum goes to one crem, you'll want your father to go there as well. But beyond that, I think tradition perhaps is a construct which the sector uses to deliver a whole range of services and justify delivering those services. As I said, like with cremation, we buried people in the UK from the sort of Roman times all the way up to 1967. In one generation, it changed from burial to cremation. Yeah. So there was a tradition of 1,000 years, which went in 30 years.
So on that very difficult question for you at the end, Brendan, probably as a way of wrapping up, I think of what I hear is that things are changing, people's expectations are changing, regulation is changing, and as a sector, we need to change with that. And I think a couple of things we can start to adopt is like you say, start small, every little bit counts. Yeah. And it's in fact the sum of the whole that will make the difference. But buy local. So whether it be granite or anything else, buy local. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So for those of you that are out there in the webinar world, thank you very much, Brendan, tonight. nice way to spend a Thursday night, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your holiday. For everybody else, as I mentioned, the webinar has been recorded, and we will be sending out a recording and a transcript for those of you that are interested. So thank you very much again tonight, Brendan. I appreciate your time.
No, I've really enjoyed it, Leanne. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.